Usually when you pick up a piece of nonfiction, especially an ebook dealing with sociology or like cultural critiques or gender dynamics,
Right.
you kind of expect a certain architectural stability.
Yeah, you anticipate a consistent worldview.
Exactly. You expect an author who establishes a clear thesis,
Hmm.
builds a foundation, plants their flag in the ground, and then spends the next 300 pages methodically defending that specific territory.
Right. You expect a reliable narrator, a guided, logical tour through a singular, cohesive perspective. I mean, even if you completely disagree with the author, you at least know where they stand.
Yeah, you know the rules of engagement. But imagine opening an ebook and reading a fiercely passionate, unapologetic manifesto that demands the total dismantling of one side of society.
And it's aggressive.
Very aggressive. It's articulate, and it pulls absolutely no punches. And then you turn the page, and the author has completely shed that identity.
Just entire.
They've swapped their entire ideological framework, assumed a brand new persona, and are suddenly writing a blistering counter-manifesto attacking the exact demographic they were championing just pages prior.
It is the absolute definition of ideological whiplash.
It really is.
It's deeply disorienting, incredibly provocative, and it forces the reader to, well, completely abandon their preconceived expectations of how a cultural critique is even supposed to function. You're no longer just reading a book.
No.
You are being subjected to a psychological stress test.
Well, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are unpacking an incredibly intense, highly controversial, and honestly, utterly fascinating new ebook titled Satanic Feminism, The War on Traditional Masculinity by Connie Riker.
It is quite the title.
It is. And before we plunge into the deep end of this text, I need to ask you, our listener, to do us a quick favor. Please take a second right now to like and subscribe to the channel and our feed.
It really helps.
It genuinely helps us keep bringing you these intense, comprehensive explorations of really complex material. And trust me, you are going to want to stick around for this one.
Oh, absolutely.
Whether you think you know exactly where you stand on gender dynamics or you are just completely exhausted by the endless culture wars, this ebook is a wild, unpredictable ride that will challenge the mechanics of every assumption you hold. You're going to want to read this for yourself.
It truly operates in a lane of its own. It functions less like a traditional essay and more like a psychological mirror reflecting the absolute extremes of our modern discourse.
It does. And that brings us to the core mission of today's deep dive, and a non-negotiable ground rule we need to establish right at the top.
Yeah, we have to be clear about this.
We are dealing with highly politically charged, explosive content today. This text wades into radical feminism, cultural Marxism, men's rights, and some of the most polarizing radioactive corners of the modern gender debate. So hear me clearly. Our job today is not to take a side. We are not here to endorse any of these viewpoints, validate the political claims, or play referee in the culture war. We are here strictly as your guides.
Think of us as cartographers.
Exactly. We're trying to impartially map out the arguments the author is making. We want to help you understand the architecture of this cultural critique, how the arguments are constructed, and why they are designed to elicit such a visceral reaction.
And the architecture of this text is arguably its most fascinating feature. I mean, the source material reads like two warring manifestos trapped in a single pressurized binding.
It really does.
It violently oscillates between a radical, unapologetic female supremacist voice and a deeply aggrieved, highly defensive, traditional male voice.
It's a deliberate exercise in holding two extreme, diametrically opposed realities in the exact same space.
Right, forcing the reader to endure the friction between them.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to really grasp the mechanics of what Riker is doing, we have to examine the opening sequence of the book.
The preface and the introduction.
Right. They are fundamentally at war with one another. It's not a gentle disagreement, it is total ideological warfare.
They are entirely hostile to one another, both in substance and in tone.
So you open the book, and the preface is written from this militant, unyielding, female supremacist perspective. It literally declares a scorched earth war on the patriarchy.
The text does not mince words here.
No, it states, point blank, that masculinity is inherently toxic.
Right.
The author uses this phrasing that it's not just a few bad apples, it's the entire orchard that is poisoned.
Right.
It outlines an argument that men have spent centuries engineering a systemic architecture designed exclusively to benefit themselves at the expense of women. extracting emotional labor, demanding silence, and enforcing subjugation.
But then it goes a step further.
Yeah, it crosses the line from a demand for equality into a demand for absolute supremacy.
Yeah.
The author writes that the book will expose a hidden truth, that women are not just equal to men, but biologically and morally superior.
It urges the reader to participate in building a new world where women hold absolute authority.
Now, what is critical to understand about this preface is the psychological profiling of its intended audience.
This is key. This section is explicitly written for an audience that feels possessed by a negative animus. Specifically, a radical, female supremacist feminist audience that is allied with cultural Marxists.
All right.
A demographic that views the dismantling of traditional masculinity and the foundational structures of Western civilization not as a tragedy, but as a necessary, joyful liberation.
And the mechanism here is validation. The text tells the reader that their rage is entirely justified,
Yeah.
that there will be no apologies, no compromises, and absolutely no mercy.
It's precision engineered to pump the reader up, tapping into a very raw, very real vein of cultural fury. It weaponizes that anger right out of the gate.
So then
That's
you turn the page.
Exactly. You turn the page, you enter the introduction, and it is a whiplash-inducing 180-degree turn.
The tone, the vocabulary, the underlying philosophy, everything shifts.
It's as if a completely different human being hijacked the keyboard. The structural pivot is so aggressive, it suddenly addresses men directly, adopting the protective, defensive voice of a traditionalist, advocating for the preservation of classical masculinity.
Right. The introduction looks directly at the male reader and tells him that he has been sold a catastrophic lie.
It asserts that the entire concept of toxic masculinity is not a sociological reality, but rather a linguistic trap.
A trap specifically designed to keep men subservient, guilty, and stripped of their natural power.
It reassures men that their biological imperatives, their rationality, their physical strength, their desire for leadership, are not toxic traits to be unlearned.
They're essential virtues to be reclaimed. And this is the part that genuinely made me do a double take. It explicitly tells the woke, cultural, Marxist, feminist reader to put the book down.
Yes.
It literally says, if you're a feminist who believes in the supremacy of women, this book is not for you. Go do something else.
It violently rejects the exact audience to the preface just spent 3 pages trying to radicalize.
It's crazy. And this deliberate rhetorical whiplash is not an accident.
Not at all. It is the author's primary psychological tool. By embodying the absolute, unfiltered extremes of both sides of the gender war, the author forces the reader to confront the unvarnished hostility that pulses beneath the surface of modern cultural discourse.
Because the author notes early on that this text operates as a work of edutainment.
Right. By adopting these radically polarized personas, Riker is holding up a high-definition mirror to society.
It's like an interactive simulation of the most toxic internet comment sections, elevated to the level of a sociological manifesto. It's like sitting at a dinner table where the author is rapidly switching chairs.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
On one side of the table, they're playing the role of the ultimate radical feminist, staring you down and demanding total, unconditional supremacy.
Right.
Then they jump up, sprint to the other side of the table, sit down, and play the ultimate aggrieved men's rights advocate, warning you about the insidious, civilization-destroying nature of cultural Marxism. How are we, the readers, supposed to find any stable ground in a setup designed to keep the earth moving under our feet?
To understand the why behind this, we have to look at the mechanics of disorientation.
Okay.
The instability is the point. The author actively does not want you to find stable ground.
Why not?
Because when a reader feels comfortable, they fall back on their preconceived biases, they nod along with the parts they agree with and skim the parts they don't. By structurally disorienting you, the text strips away those comfortable middle ground platitudes.
So it forces you to pay attention.
Exactly. When your intellectual equilibrium is thrown off, you are forced into a state of hyper-awareness. You stop looking at what is being said, and you are forced to look at how it is being said.
You become acutely aware of how language, grievance, and historical trauma are actively weaponized by both extremes to manipulate the audience.
And that structural disorientation sets up the first major conceptual theme the book tackles.
Right, and this is a theme that applies to both sides of this agonizing divide, the concept of the double bind.
The text refers to the double bind as the ultimate weapon of control.
Now, I want to make sure we're really clear on the mechanics here. What exactly makes a double bind different from, say, a standard dilemma or a tough choice?
That is a crucial distinction. In psychology, specifically tracing back to Gregory Bateson's theory of schizophrenia and communication, A double bind is not just a difficult choice between two bad options.
Okay.
It is an impossible situation where a person is subjected to two conflicting, mutually exclusive demands, and neither choice resolves the situation.
Wow.
Furthermore, the individual is not allowed to opt out of the situation or point out the contradiction. It is a no-win scenario that creates a closed loop of failure.
And the book argues that modern society has weaponized these double binds.
Deploying them systemically to trap both men and women, which generates a state of chronic anxiety and perpetual inadequacy.
Okay, let me offer an analogy to see if I've got the mechanics right.
Go for it.
It's like a catastrophic software glitch in a computer program. The prompt on the screen says, press enter to save your file, press escape to delete your file.
Okay.
But because the system is inherently corrupted, pressing enter deletes the file, and pressing escape also deletes the file. And if you sit there and do nothing, the system times out and deletes the file.
Right.
The illusion is that you have a choice, but the reality is that the architecture of the system guarantees your failure regardless of your input.
That is a perfect encapsulation of the mechanism. The illusion of agency masks the reality of systemic control.
So the text applies this concept first to the expectations placed on men. It meticulously outlines how men are subjected to this corrupted software.
Right.
On one hand, society constantly reinforces the demand that men must be strong, stoic, unyielding providers. They must be the bedrock.
But simultaneously, a newer cultural narrative aggressively shames them for being emotionally unavailable.
So society broadcasts the message, open up, be vulnerable, cry, deconstruct your stoicism.
But the text argues that this is a trap.
Yeah. The moment a man actually lowers his shield and exhibits raw emotional vulnerability, he is met not with empathy, but with visceral disgust.
The author provides a highly specific structural example of this dynamic playing out in the corporate sphere to illustrate the asymmetry of the trap.
The CEO example.
Exactly. The text sets up a hypothetical scenario comparing a male CEO and a female CEO who are forced to navigate the exact same professional crisis, laying off a significant portion of their workforce.
Right.
The book claims that when the male CEO breaks down and cries during the layoff announcement, the cultural and media reaction is instantly punitive. He is labeled weak, unstable, and deemed unfit for leadership.
His vulnerability is proof of his incompetence.
But however, when a female CEO cries during an identical announcement, the reaction is inverted. She is praised by the media apparatus for being empathetic, authentic, and demonstrating human-centric leadership.
And the book argues this isn't just a casual double standard or an annoying hypocrisy. It's a form of emotional tyranny.
It is the software glitch in action.
If you stay stoic and reserved, you are branded as toxic and repressed. If you show genuine, messy emotion, you are branded as pathetic and weak. There is literally no acceptable way for a man to exist within those parameters.
But the book doesn't stop there.
No, it flips the lens entirely and examines how women are caught in a parallel architecture of impossible expectations.
Precisely. The text demonstrates that women are snared in a similarly paralyzing trap, though the parameters are different.
Right, the trad wife versus the girl boss paradox.
Exactly. If a woman chooses to rely on a man for financial support or prioritizes domestic life, the modern cultural narrative heavily penalizes her. She is labeled a gold digger, a parasite, or a traitor to feminist progress.
She's the trad wife who is actively upholding patriarchal oppression.
But if she pursues the opposite path, if she becomes fiercely independent, ruthlessly career-driven, and refuses to rely on anyone, society penalizes her on a different axis.
She is branded as cold, unfeminine, selfish, and intimidating. She becomes the stereotypical girl boss who is deemed impossible to love. You are damned if you participate, and you're damned if you abstain.
Yep.
But there is a specific intimate example in the text regarding men's vulnerability that really stuck with me. And it takes this idea of the double bind out of the theoretical realm and into the living room.
The childhood trauma anecdote?
Yes. The author shares a narrative about a man who, after years of conditioning, finally decides to open up to his partner about a deeply traumatic event from his childhood.
He believes he's following the new rules.
Right. He's being vulnerable. He is attempting to forge a deeper emotional connection. He is showing his fragile human side. Then weeks later, during a completely unrelated heated argument, the partner takes that specific childhood trauma and hurls it back in his face, mocking him as being damaged goods.
What is most revealing about that specific anecdote is not just the cruelty of the act, but how the text analyzes the function of that cruelty.
That's calculating.
Right. The author does not frame this as a simple interpersonal failure. a lapse in emotional regulation, or a heat-of-the-moment mistake. The text frames it as a calculated, deliberate strategy.
It argues that within the context of this modern gender war, vulnerabilities are no longer treated as bridges for connection. They are treated as an opponent's Achilles heel.
They're exposed purely to be cataloged and exploited later for conversational leverage.
The chronic, low-level anxiety, this creates the perpetual awareness that your emotional honesty is being stockpiled as ammunition for future conflicts, is what the author identifies as the primary mechanism for interpersonal control. I have to push back on the book's fundamental premise here, though.
Okay, let's hear it.
I mean, I understand the pain of the double bind, but the book claims this is a deliberate strategy to maintain control. It implies a level of coordinated malice.
It does.
But is it really a conscious systemic strategy? Or are we just looking at the messy, chaotic, often painful friction of a society in massive transition?
That's a fair point.
Think about it. We've essentially thrown out the centuries-old rule book of how men and women are supposed to relate to each other. But the new rule book hasn't actually been finalized yet.
The ink is still wet.
Exactly. And half the pages are missing. So aren't people just stumbling around in the dark, hurting each other by accident because the cultural expectations are completely contradictory? Is it malice, or is it just profound systemic confusion?
That is a highly astute critique of the text's methodology. The book absolutely possesses a tendency to assign deliberate, malicious intent to broad sociological shifts.
Right.
By framing this friction as a deliberate strategy or a coordinated war, the author is intentionally amplifying the perceived threat level. It is a rhetorical choice designed to heighten the stakes.
To keep the reader on edge.
Exactly. However, whether the root cause is conscious manipulation by one gender or simply the structural friction of transitioning norms, the psychological outcome for the individual caught in the middle remains identical.
Deep exhaustion.
Profound alienation and a creeping cynical realization that the game is fundamentally rigged against them.
And what the author argues next is that this feeling of a rigged game isn't just a localized phenomenon happening in private relationships.
No, it's institutional.
It is a philosophy that was deliberately engineered and institutionalized within academia, which then bled into modern public discourse.
And this transition brings us to the intellectual origin point of the entire conflict, according to the traditionalist persona in the book.
Right. The text takes a massive deep dive into the historical roots of modern cultural theory, aiming its crosshairs directly at the Frankfurt School, cultural Marxism, and specifically the philosopher Herbert Marcuse.
Now, for the listener who might not be familiar with mid-20th century sociological history, how does the book explain the mechanics of the Frankfurt School and its relevance to a modern gender war?
Well, to understand the book's argument, we have to unpack the history it relies on. The Frankfurt School was a collective of Marxist, German, Jewish sociologists and philosophers established in the early 20th century.
Fleeing the rise of the Nazi regime in the 1930s, many of these thinkers, including Herbert Marcuse, relocated to the United States,
bringing their philosophical frameworks into Western academia. And their primary contribution was the development of critical theory.
which is very different from traditional theory.
Exactly. Unlike traditional theory, which seeks only to understand or explain society, critical theory seeks to critique and change society as a whole by analyzing it strictly through the lens of power dynamics, systemic oppression, and emancipation.
And the defensive traditionalist voice in this book absolutely skewers this academic migration.
Oh, it goes hard. The text asserts that Marcuse and the Frankfurt School did not just bring philosophy, they brought a blueprint to dismantle Western civilization from the inside out.
And the mechanism they chose to achieve this, according to the author, was a coordinated attack on the most foundational bedrock of human society, the nuclear family.
The book argues that critical theory was deployed to convince women that they were not partners in a cooperative familial enterprise, but rather that they were inherently oppressed by the very men who loved them, provided for them, and protected them.
By introducing the oppressor-oppressed dynamic into the household, they turned the family unit from a sanctuary into a permanent battleground.
The underlying mechanism the book is exposing here is a profound shift in how we define struggle.
Right. The text posits that cultural Marxism, particularly as adapted by thinkers like Marcuse in the 1960s, performed a very specific, highly effective ideological sleight of hand.
Historically, classical Marxist rhetoric was entirely predicated on class struggle. the economic tension between the proletariat, the workers, and the bourgeoisie, the owners.
It was about the haves versus the have-nots.
But as the Western working class became more affluent and less revolutionary post-World War II, the author argues that modern academia shifted the framework entirely.
They replaced economic class struggle with cultural and identity struggle.
It was no longer about rich versus poor. The new revolutionary base was built on marginalized identities. It became about race, and crucially for this book, it became about gender. It became men versus women.
And the architecture of that new framework is incredibly rigid.
According to the book, in this modified Marxist model, men are universally, categorically defined as the oppressors, regardless of their individual actions or economic status,
And women are universally defined as the oppressed.
which leads directly to a phenomenon the book labels the rejection of rational discourse.
This is a huge part of the argument.
Yeah, the author argues that modern radical feminism had to solve a structural problem. What happens when objective reality, empirical data, and logic don't actually support the narrative of universal oppression?
The book's answer is chilling.
If logic doesn't support the narrative, then logic itself must be dismantled and branded as a tool of the patriarchy.
Exactly. The mechanism of critical theory requires that the tools of the oppressor be invalidated.
The text argues that objective, empirical truth has been systematically replaced in academia and activism by the concept of lived experience and emotional resonance.
Because logic, reason, and the scientific method were historically developed in male-dominated institutions, the argument goes that these tools are inherently tainted by toxic masculinity.
Therefore, appealing to statistics or rational debate is framed not as a pursuit of truth, but as an act of patriarchal violence designed to silence marginalized voices.
The book shares a remarkably vivid, highly specific anecdote to illustrate exactly how this plays out in real time.
Oh, the university lecture hall debate.
Yes, the author describes a scenario in a university lecture hall where a debate is taking place. A male student attempts to present a counter-argument regarding gender dynamics.
He stands up and he brings with him peer-reviewed statistics, economic data, and empirical studies regarding the nuances of the wage gap.
Accounting for career choices, hours worked, and risk factors.
But before he can even articulate his first data point, before the numbers even leave his mouth, a woman in the audience simply shouts, "Stop mansplaining."
Instantly, the entire room erupts in thunderous applause, and the student's data is entirely dismissed.
The book uses this specific interaction to demonstrate the mechanics of the new rulebook. It says, look, the facts were completely irrelevant. The empirical data didn't matter.
His voice was inherently deemed oppressive simply because he was a man possessing the wrong biological identity, attempting to use logic to contradict the emotional consensus of the room.
The author introduces a vital concept to describe this environment, the emotional echo chamber.
An echo chamber is a closed system.
Right. It is a space where emotional appeals and declarations of trauma constantly reinforce one another, creating a feedback loop that amplifies outrage while insulating itself from outside critique.
Within this architecture, any dissenting voice, especially a male voice utilizing rational discourse, is not merely disagreed with. It is treated as a systemic threat that must be drowned out, canceled, or expelled.
The text points to the cultural treatment of figures like Jordan Peterson as the ultimate case study of this mechanism.
The book claims that Peterson was not labeled a dangerous threat, a bigot, or a misogynist because he advocated for violence or hatred.
Rather, he was targeted because he fundamentally refused to accept the premise of the echo chamber.
He advocated for free speech, rational discourse, and the acknowledgement of biological realities.
He insisted on using the tools of logic, and for refusing to bow to the emotional demands of the system, the text argues he was culturally crucified.
The book also aims its critique at large-scale cultural movements, taking a particularly hard swing at the 2017 Women's March.
It analyzes the event not as a political triumph, but as a symptom of this intellectual decay.
The text argues that what ostensibly began as a movement for equality rapidly devolved into a massive, unregulated festival of emotional slogans.
Slogans like "The future is female" were plastered on every sign, t-shirt, and social media feed.
But the book asks a very pointed structural question. Behind the slogans, where were the nuanced intellectual debates? Where were the actual viable policy proposals?
The author argues that the movement prioritized collective hysteria, emotional branding, and the performance of rage over any rational, methodical approach to solving complex societal problems. It was the triumph of feeling overdoing.
If we synthesize this sprawling critique of academia and cultural movements, the author is suggesting a devastating outcome.
The text argues that this specific academic shift has successfully indoctrinated an entire generation of young women, turning them into an angry, entitled demographic who are utterly, fundamentally convinced of their own perpetual victimhood.
It operates as a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Think about the psychological mechanism here. If a university teaches you to view absolutely every human interaction, from a casual conversation to a job interview to a romantic relationship, strictly through the lens of power dynamics and systemic oppression, you will inevitably find oppression everywhere you look.
Even in spaces where it fundamentally does not exist.
Your brain is trained to see ghosts.
Which provides a seamless transition into what I found to be the most cynical, provocative, and honestly brilliant concept in the entire book.
Okay, here we go.
It's an idea that pulls all of this philosophical theory down into the brutal reality of modern capitalism.
The text outlines what the author has coined the victim industrial complex and its operational engine, the profit from pain paradigm.
These are incredibly heavy loaded terms. The book is making a profound economic argument here.
It is asserting that victimhood has evolved. It is no longer simply a social status or a call for empathy. It has been aggressively monetized. It has been transformed into an industry.
A multi-billion-dollar, globally scaled industry.
The text methodically claims that an entire ecosystem spanning self-help book publishing, daytime television media, Hollywood narrative structures, and most crucially, the architecture of social media networks, thrives financially strictly by keeping women trapped in a state of perpetual, agonizing victimhood.
While simultaneously painting men as the eternal, irredeemable oppressors.
Because, from an economic standpoint, nuance does not scale. Outrage sells.
The algorithms that power our digital lives are mathematically optimized to prioritize engagement, and the most efficient driver of human engagement is high arousal, negative emotion.
There is a remarkably striking story in the text that strips this abstract economic theory down to a painful human level.
Oh, the engagement ring story.
Yes, the author recounts the story of a man who was relentlessly pressured into buying a $5,000 diamond engagement ring for his partner.
And the critical detail is that he did not have the financial means to do this.
Right. He was forced to take out a high-interest loan, plunging himself into significant debt just to purchase this specific piece of jewelry.
And the book asks why. Why would a rational person do this?
Because the cultural narrative, heavily pushed by this victim industrial complex, had successfully convinced his partner that if he did not make this massive, painful financial sacrifice, he was somehow deeply complicit in the systemic historical oppression of women.
He wasn't just buying a ring, he was paying a ransom.
Exactly. He had to prove his devotion and his allyship by feeding his own financial stability into a consumerist machine that was brilliantly masking itself as an instrument of female empowerment.
What is genuinely fascinating here is the ideological paradox the book is exposing within modern consumerist feminism.
Feminism, at its philosophical core, claims to be the ultimate vehicle for empowering women.
Yet according to the analytical framework of this text, this modern monetized iteration actually traps women in a state of permanent dependency.
Let's look at the mechanism. By framing every single challenge, every minor inconvenience, and every moment of interpersonal friction as evidence of vast systemic oppression, it systematically strips women of their individual agency.
If you are trained to believe you are always a victim, and that an omnipotent patriarchal system is always to blame for your unhappiness, you surrender your internal locus of control.
You become psychologically powerless, entirely dependent on the system to validate your pain.
But wait, let's look at the role of the social media algorithms in this ecosystem, because this is where my brain really started spinning.
Okay, let's hear it.
The book argues that these platforms create a horrific feedback loop of outrage that can literally destroy men's lives, ruining careers and reputations without a shred of due process, based entirely on the velocity of accusations.
Right.
But if the algorithm's only goal is to feed on outrage to generate ad revenue, aren't both the radical feminists and the radical anti-feminists feeding the exact same machine?
Oh, I see where you're going with this.
I want to update a metaphor I was thinking of earlier. It's not just two gladiators fighting to the death in the Colosseum for honor. It's an economic model.
The gladiators are bleeding all over the sand, hacking each other to pieces, convinced their cause is righteous.
But neither of them realizes that the arena owner up in the VIP box doesn't care who wins. The owner is selling the tickets to the crowd, he's selling the swords to the gladiators, and he's selling the bandages to the survivors.
He is the only one actually making a profit.
Both extreme ends of the gender war are just unpaid laborers generating content for the algorithm. They're both being played.
That is precisely the dynamic at play, and it perfectly illustrates the profit from pain paradigm.
The algorithm is ideologically agnostic.
It does not care which side is morally right, nor does it care which side is winning the argument. Its only directive is that the argument must happen. It must be loud, it must be public, and it must be constant.
The platforms literally monetize the conflict itself, turning societal friction into capital.
And the ultimate tragedy, as the book relentlessly points out, is the tangible collateral damage left in the wake of this digital harvesting.
We are talking about real lives, real careers, and real mental health being ground into dust by a machine that only values engagement.
Which transitions us into the deeply sobering reality of this conflict. Because this collateral damage isn't just an abstract sociological theory happening in the cloud.
The book spends significant time detailing the tangible, real-world erasure of men, the active demonization of male sexuality, and the systematic dismantling of dedicated male spaces.
The author constructs a compelling argument that normal, historically essential male behaviors, the deep-seated biological and sociological desires to protect, to provide, to compete, to endure physical hardship without complaint, are now routinely and clinically pathologized.
Under the new cultural framework, these are no longer viewed as virtues necessary for the survival of a community. They are diagnosed as dangerous symptoms of toxic masculinity that must be eradicated.
The book highlights a massive, glaring double standard when it comes to the framing of human sexuality, and it uses linguistic analysis to prove its point.
Take the word lustful.
Right. The text points out that when the concept of lust is applied to a male subject, the cultural reaction is immediate suspicion. Lustful becomes a slur.
It implies that the man is inherently predatory, dangerous, a threat to safety who cannot control his base urges.
But when that exact same concept, the expression of raw sexual desires applied to a woman, the cultural framing flips entirely.
It is celebrated, it is branded as sexual agency, it is empowerment, it is owning her truth and her body.
This linguistic asymmetry connects directly to the book's sharp, unforgiving critique of what it terms choice feminism.
Choice feminism is the ideology suggesting that absolutely any choice a woman makes is inherently empowering and feminist simply by virtue of the fact that a woman made it.
Right, and the book aggressively attacks the modern OnlyFans culture on this exact point.
It argues that young women are being sold a catastrophic lie.
The cultural narrative tells them that by stripping down, monetizing their intimacy, and selling explicit content directly to the male gaze on these platforms, they are fiercely independent entrepreneurs and CEOs of their own brand.
But the text dismantles this illusion. It argues they are not CEOs, they do not own the infrastructure.
They are simply commodities. They are still just being exploited by male desires and male-owned tech platforms, but the cultural narrative has been brilliantly twisted to make the women feel empowered by their own sexual commodification.
It's the ultimate victory of the victim industrial complex, convincing the product that it is the merchant.
And if we look at the flip side of how the modern gender dynamic is reshaping professional environments, the book addresses the severe long-term chilling effect of the #MeToo movement.
The text is careful to acknowledge the movement's initial necessary intentions regarding accountability for actual abuse.
Right.
However, it argues that the pendulum has swung so far that it has created an environment of intense, paralyzing workplace paranoia.
The book details how risk assessment for men has fundamentally changed. Men are now terrified to mentor young female colleagues, terrified to travel with them for business, or even casually interact with them in a one-on-one setting.
Why? Because the fear of a career-ending accusation, one that bypasses due process and is adjudicated instantly by the court of public opinion, is too high a risk.
The result is a behavioral withdrawal. Men pull back. They refuse to offer mentorship or collaboration, which ultimately hinders the professional progress of women and constructs a silent, invisible wall of suspicion between the genders in corporate spaces.
And that withdrawal, that pulling back, isn't just happening in the sterile environment of the workplace. It is happening everywhere, in every facet of society.
The book introduces a concept it calls the silent epidemic.
The absolutely skyrocketing, terrifying rates of male suicide, depression, and massive mental health crises among young men.
And the author draws a direct causal link between this epidemic and the systematic erasure of male spaces.
Historically, there were physical and social places where men used to gather to form deep bonds, share burdens, mentor younger generations, and find a sense of community.
The text argues that these spaces have been either actively dismantled or socially shamed as being exclusionary and patriarchal.
When you analyze the compounding effect of these variables, the picture becomes incredibly bleak.
You combine the physical loss of these necessary communal spaces with an omnipresent cultural narrative that constantly broadcasts to men that their natural instincts are toxic,
That their logic is inherently oppressive.
and that any vulnerability they show will be weaponized against them. You are engineering a perfect psychological storm for profound alienation.
Men are essentially being told by society that they are the historical villains of the human story, and crucially, they are given absolutely no viable, culturally approved alternative path to find self-worth, meaning, or redemption.
Whether you, the listener, agree with the book's overarching premise or not, whether you think the author is offering a spot-on diagnosis of a cultural sickness or is completely dangerously unhinged.
The underlying statistics are not up for debate.
Exactly. The statistics on male isolation, the skyrocketing rates of male depression, and the catastrophic numbers regarding male suicide are very real. They are an undeniable empirical reality.
And this forces a terrifying question to the surface.
How does a society actually function, let alone thrive, when half of its demographic population feels fundamentally alienated and despised by the culture they live in?
When men feel like they are nothing more than collateral damage in an endless, vindictive cultural revolution, what happens to the structural integrity of the social fabric?
That is the core existential question the entire book revolves around. And the author brings that massive societal question home in the final chapters, focusing the lens on the most intimate, fundamental building block of human civilization, the nuclear family.
Right. As the book moves towards its conclusion, it tackles the concept of the family, and true to the deeply disorienting form we established at the beginning, the text gives us two completely contradictory, warring views.
It perfectly embodies the ideological whiplash of the entire manuscript.
The contrast is staggering. On one side, the radical female supremacist voice within the text openly celebrates the modern collapse of the traditional family structure.
This persona views the nuclear family not as a sanctuary, but as a patriarchal scam. A localized prison designed specifically to control women's reproductive labor, economic output, and bodily autonomy.
This voice cheers on skyrocketing divorce rates and the fragmentation of the household as the necessary destruction of an oppressive era.
But immediately countering that, the traditionalist voice mourns the loss of the family unit with a profound sense of grief.
This persona views the collapse of the nuclear family as a civilization-ending tragedy.
It argues that by destroying the family, we have destroyed the only stable, naturally occurring, loving environment necessary for children to develop properly.
And this voice places the blame squarely on the institutional education system, claiming that schools are no longer teaching academics, but are actively indoctrinating children.
Teaching young girls to instinctively view men as potential oppressors, and teaching young boys to feel deep, inherent shame for their own masculinity before they even reach puberty.
And this intense, unrelenting ideological tug-of-war culminates in a truly jarring, unexpected epilogue.
After spending hundreds of dense pages oscillating between these two extremes, analyzing the profound pain, the hypocrisy, and the structural failures on both sides of the gender divide, the reader naturally expects some form of synthesis.
A conclusion, a proposed bridge, or a compromise.
But the book offers none of that.
No, instead, it ends with a massive, unapologetic, 2,000-word call to action advocating for the absolute dawn of female supremacy.
The final pages urge women to abandon any hope of equality, to burn the existing system to the ground, and to build a new world order where men are entirely, permanently subjugated.
It is a stunning refusal to seek peace.
So we have to ask, what does this all mean? We've waded through this incredibly intense, deeply contradictory, furiously angry text. What is the ultimate sociological takeaway from Satanic Feminism?
If we synthesize the entirety of the text, the deliberate contradictions, the weaponized anger, the deep sociological critiques of academia and capitalism, the ultimate tragedy outlined in this book is the terrifying reality of a zero-sum game.
The author has effectively demonstrated that because both extreme sides of the culture war now view gender relations not as a partnership, but as a battle to the death, where one side must absolutely conquer and destroy the other, the concept of mutual respect has completely evaporated.
The book itself is a performance piece. It is a simulation of our cultural inability to coexist.
It graphically illustrates that when empowerment is defined strictly as the subjugation and domination of the other, humanity as a whole loses.
It really is a dark, high-definition mirror reflecting the most toxic, uncompromising, radioactive corners of our modern cultural divide.
It forces you to look at the ugly, grinding machinery of how we argue, how we ruthlessly monetize each other's pain, and how we systematically weaponize vulnerability for temporary leverage.
It demands, uncomfortably so, that the reader confront the psychological and societal consequences of choosing to live inside an emotional echo chamber.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to mull over as we wrap up this deep dive. If a single piece of literature can successfully embody the extreme, uncompromising, white-hot rage of both sides of the gender war so convincingly, what does that actually say about our collective ability to hear each other anymore?
Are we permanently doomed to just hurl manifestos back and forth across a widening, uncrossable abyss?
Or is there a mechanism, a way to hack the system, to break the cycle of the double bind entirely? Can we find the courage to step out of the gladiator arena, stop feeding the algorithm, and actually see each other as human beings again?
That is the monumental, urgent work that remains for all of us.
Exactly. Now, if you want to experience this wild, incisive, disorienting, and truly fascinating read for yourself, and I highly recommend you do, if only to experience the sheer rhetorical gymnastics and psychological pressure testing firsthand, you absolutely need to check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the ebook. It will challenge you.
It is undeniably a text that provokes deep, necessary critical thought, regardless of where your personal ideology lies.
Also, if you want to dive even deeper into the author's world, to see how these polarizing ideas are being developed and discussed in real time, make sure to follow at Conrad Treicher at Substack. Finally, please remember to like and subscribe to the channel and our feed. Your support is the engine that allows us to keep digging through the cultural noise, reading the heavy texts, and bringing you these deep dives. Thank you so much for joining us on this intense intellectual journey today. Keep questioning the architecture around you, and we'll see you next time.